Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we will discuss about Azure DevOps YAML based pipeline. In our previous discussion, we have learned about the pipeline configuration with Azure DevOps using the classic UI based approach. Now with this video, we will learn how do we configure the pipeline as a code with the help of YAML. Now, just to revise our previous discussion about the pipeline as a concept, with the help of this board. So with a pipeline, what we have is a very first thing is the repository location. So we need to have where is your source code. So where are your repository? That is what we need. Second thing you can configure is you can configure the schedules with the pipeline. So you could have the date and time based schedule to trigger your pipeline on a specific timeline. You can also set up the pipeline triggers on a various event. So you could set up a triggers like, do we want to trigger a pipeline on a commit to a specific source code branch or the pull request or any other event. So there are multiple options available. So basically trigger is one of the point which we can configure. Next thing you can configure with the pipeline is the variables. So with Azure DevOps, you could have the variables which we can configure with the pipeline. Apart from the variables in the YAML based pipeline, you can also configure the parameters. So parameter is another type of variables which you can configure. Now, what is the difference between the parameters and variables? Parameters are by default, the behavior of parameter is you can override the parameter values at the runtime. So you can, when you run the pipeline at the runtime, you can by default override the values, whereas the variables you cannot by default override the values. So no override values. Okay. Now, next we can do with the pipeline is you can define the environment variables if you would like to. So this is another type of variables which you can define with the environment variable, which can be used as in pipeline. These variable could be the standalone variable type, or you can define as the group variable as well. So from the library section, we can create a group variable, and then that group variables which we can use it here in our pipeline. Okay. Next, you can define the metrics of the pipeline. So metrics, let's say on a combination of certain parameters, you would like to run the pipeline as the whole set. For example, you may want to run the pipeline on the different operating system, for example Mac OS, Linux, or Windows based. So you can define a metrics on that. Or you may want to, let's say, create your compile time parameter on the x32-bit compilation or x64-bit compilation, just to make sure that your application build output is compatible with the both x64 and 32, both the type of operating system. So that is what another thing which you can configure with the pipeline. So this is all the configuration which options which are available. And the next thing what you can define is the steps or the stages. Next thing what you can define is the stages. So each pipeline must have at least one stage. So you could have multiple stages. So stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3, something like that. And in each stage you could have the job collection. So job collection would have the number of jobs. So I could have the job 1 here with this stage 1, job 2 with this stage 1, and then job 3 with this stage 1. Similarly, in this stage 2, I could have the job 1 and then job 2, and so on. Now, with each job, you could have the different steps. So steps are nothing, just the task underneath task which you runs on these pipelines. So I could have this step 1, then again step 2. Now the next thing what you can define, which we have missed here with the pipeline, you can define the agent pool. So agent pool configuration, which you can define with the pipeline, and in the agent pool you can say that I would like to run all my pipeline with let's say Linux based platform or Mac OS platform, or maybe let's say Windows based platform. So we have seen in our previous discussion that there are multiple versions of each of these platform available with Microsoft Azure, and then on top of that you can configure your own self-hosted agent as well, and then you can give the self-hosted agent as the agent pool configuration to run your pipeline. This is the configuration you can run at the global level, but you can also configure the same configuration at the different jobs level as well. So I could say, let's say agent 1 is going to applicable here on the job 1, agent 2 is going to applicable for the job 3, and let's say job 2 will run from the global agent setting which we have it at the top. Okay, so that's how you can define your configuration. And same thing which we have seen yesterday, so nothing new, is just the hierarchy of the configuration which you can define as the YAML code to configure your pipeline. Let's go back to our Azure DevOps project and we'll implement our very first YAML pipeline from there. I went to the same Azure DevOps project which we have used in our last discussion to discuss the classical pipeline configuration. Now from that we are going to create the YAML based pipeline. To create a new YAML based pipeline onto a given repository, let's say this is my repository under this particular project, I would like to create a YAML based pipeline. So what I can do here is I can go to this pipeline icon, click here on the pipeline section, and then you can find all your existing pipeline. And if you would like to create new, click here on the new button, select the repository location where you have your code, as we know that our code into the same Azure DevOps Git repository. So we are going to choose this particular option. This because we would like to configure our pipeline as YAML, and you can see that this is the YAML based option which we have. Here you need to specify the repository on which you would like to perform your or configure your YAML based pipeline. It means that whenever you are going to configure the YAML based pipeline, your pipeline will be checked in as the source code file onto these repository. So let's say if I'm selecting this one, this is where my YAML file will be checked into. I'll show in a moment. Next, you have two options here by default. Do we want to start a new pipeline with scratch, or do you have the existing pipeline already, YAML file already checked into your repository, and you would like to configure a pipeline using that existing YAML file? If that's the case, you can choose this option. Apart from these two options, you do have certain built-in templates available to deploy your application or to configure your YAML-based pipelines. If I click here on the show more, you'll see that we have number of options available to configure the pipeline, like option to deploy and configure the ASP.NET application, build Docker image, deploy to the container registry, build and deploy Go application, Python-based application, and so on and so on. Now, to start for this discussion, I'm going to use the start a new pipeline, starter pipeline option, which is very first option. And this will give a default template for our pipeline. We'll go into the detail of this default template. Before that, have a look at this particular configuration here. This shows that this is the repository which we have selected in our second selection, and this is the name of the file which will be created inside this repository, and this entire YAML file will be checked in as the YAML file into this particular repository, and this is the location of the repository. So now if in case if you would like to change the repository location, I can simply change it like this, and this change you would be only able to make it right from here. If you are creating a pipeline from the beginning. If you have the existing pipeline, or if you're trying to edit the pipeline, then the modification of the location, you won't be able to do that from here. Now here you can define your variables with the pipelines with this variable button. We'll go into the detail of that option later on. Next to that, we have the save and run option. So as soon as I'm going to save, it will basically commit the change to directly to this master branch or to the sub branch in the selected repository. So if I just simply create it, it will save the change into the repository. I'll show you in a moment. So if you look at the folder, there is a folder created pipeline, because we have mentioned that our pipeline file should be checked in inside the pipeline folder. So there is a folder created, and inside that folder, the pipeline has been saved. Now coming back to the pipeline, it's automatically running. Why is it so? Let's look at that. I'll go back here and I'll try to edit. You can anytime edit the existing pipeline with this edit option. It's really easy to understand. It was automatically running. The reason for that is because of this trigger, because by default when you create or choose a starter template, this template has the trigger defined, which runs on the main or master branch. So as we have checked in this YAML file onto the master branch, this eventually has triggered our default pipeline. And so here I'm just trying to compare our discussion, what we had with the pipeline. So as you can see, this is the trigger part. So trigger is something which we can define it here, but apart from this, you can define the repository, which I have mentioned. So if I select our option resources, so under the resources, if I press a double tab here, you can define your resources, and which is repository. So this is your repository, which you can specify what is the name of your repository. That is called your resources. Okay, now apart from these resources, you can also define the different packages or the pipelines or the webhooks or the build IDs. Let's say if this particular pipeline is dependent on some other builds, then you can define that as well with the resources option. You could have the schedule option with this schedule, so you can specify the cron job here as schedule, which your pipeline is based on. Okay. Next, you could have the triggers, which we have already mentioned, and with the trigger you could have the pull request as well, and you can also use the include exclude section as well. Now to define, you can also define the variables like I mentioned, and if I just add the variable's name, so there are different type of variable. You can define the variable as the variable group, which is already available here in the library section. So any variable library, you can use those variables here. If you have the standalone variables, which you want to use, let's say var1, you can define it like this, and then value of the variable can be defined as the value 1 here, something like that. You can combine all together. For example, I could have the variable as group, and then let's say test group. Obviously that test group is not available, so I will get an error, but this is just to show you. You could also have a YAML template which could have all the variables defined. So for example, I could have my variables .yaml, which I can define it on my repository, and that my variable.yaml, I can refer it here. Okay, so this is how you can define the variables as well. Next to that, we have the parameters, what we have mentioned here. So you could have the parameters as well. So with parameter, again, you can define the name of the parameter. Let's say param1, I could have the value of the parameter. Let's say default value is true, so obviously type is going to be boolean, and then I could set the display name property as well for my parameter type. So these are my display names. So let's say destroy. So that's going to be display name for my environment. Here is the agent pool configuration. So as I mentioned, agent pool is the machine on which your CI/CD steps or stages are going to run. So that's what the agent pool configuration is by default defined at the global layer. So all this configuration, by the way, we are defining, these are the global configuration, and then you would have the stages or steps on which this global properties or the configuration can be used, and it will be applicable or available across all the stages or the steps. Now with that pool, we can define the what is the VM image. Is it Ubuntu latest or any other version of Ubuntu? Is it going to be a Windows latest? So I could have the agent pool something like that, Windows latest. Okay, and then I can set the name of the agent pool, let's say my pool, and then I can refer this name to the various jobs in my pipeline. So I could define multiple pools, something like that. Okay, no demands I would like to see. Additional property, you can check that out, or the documentations. All the documentations are given here at the this URL about the YAML, which is very much self-explanatory, which you can define. So for now I'm going to just remove this group and variable because we don't have those. So if you look at the discussion what I had here, I mentioned that we can have these stages, and then inside this stage you could have the jobs, multiple jobs, and inside the jobs you could have the steps. Whereas here we are directly defining the steps and there is no stage or job. So this means that by default it will create a default job for you. You don't need to define a job here explicitly, so it will run under a single default job and default stage basically. So there will be a default stage and default job will be created, and all the steps will be part of that default job. Now if I don't need that default job, then what I can do is I can define the stages here, and then I can say what is my stage name. So let's say stage 1, I could say, and then again next stage, and inside this stage I can say display name, let's say build. Okay, this is going to be my build stage. Similarly, this is going to be my deploy stage, for example. Okay, now within this stage, as you can see, we have the jobs, which is collection of jobs. So as I mentioned, within this stage you could have the jobs, and now you can define the job. So let's say job 1 to do some activity, then you could have the job 2 to do some more activity, for example. So for example, I could have this step, let's say step as in script. So script is one of the steps, and then I can say echo test job in job 1, for example. Okay, job 1 say 1. Similarly, I can use some other task as well. So with Azure DevOps, if I expand this full with Azure DevOps steps, you could have the task or the built-in task available. So you can see that there's a huge list of tasks available, which you can configure it. And if you want to get more detail about all these tasks, you can simply click here on this show assistant button, and you can find out any of the tasks which you may want to refer. For example, I will take a simple task, which is, let's say, copy task. So if I click here, then you can fill in those parameters. Let's say this is my source location, src, and then target location. Obviously you need to provide the fully qualified path of the task, but as soon as I click here, you can see that all my task details are being added here, and then I can simply remove this And now if I want to modify this task, I can simply click here on the setting button, and that will open the same settings what we have. You can go to the additional configuration and perform the additional configuration as well. Apart from this, you would have the additional properties which you may want to configure, such as what is the display name, copy selected file, let's say tar file. Okay, I could also set up some additional properties like that's again the option. So simply this is what the job will look like. Then again I can have my own scripts or steps which we can define it like we have defined in the job 1 section. Okay, so that's stage 1, job 1, and similarly I could have the different jobs defined here. Like this. So now if I check in this, or if you want to use, let's use these variables. So I'm going to use the variables just for the demonstration, and I'll simply remove this, and what we'll do is we will also copy it. So in order to use the variable, you can simply use the dollar opening bracket curly opening bracket closing bracket and between the name of the variable, simply like this. I'm using the variable or printing the variable value here into the job 1. Similarly, we can use the parameters. So to use the parameters, you can use it like this. So you have the parameters and then the name of the parameter. So let's say param1, which is the name of the parameter, something like this. Similarly, we can use the same variables into the subsequent job as well, into a different stage. So let's say here is my first stage, which is a build stage, and now here is the deploy stage, and I'm using this as the variables. I can anytime go ahead and just skip this. Okay, now let's save this, because now our pipeline is YAML. So let's change this particular pipeline, commit the source code. It should automatically trigger the pipeline because of the triggered what we have with the pipeline, and it's failing right now. Let's see. It says that the job name cannot have the dashes in the name, so that's one of the reason. So now if I go to the edit pipeline, I can simply go ahead and modify the name of my job. So simply I can put the underscore. I believe the underscore should work. Let's see. I'll save it again and check if it is working. So as soon as we have checked in our source code, it has we have 2 stages. Stage 1, which is build stage, and within the stage 1 we have 2 jobs, and then we have next stage, which is a deploy stage. Now if I click here on the pipeline, that will go to the details of the pipeline steps. Here you have the stage, which is build, and then you have the jobs, job 1, and inside the job 1, these are the command which we have used. So now if I open here, this is the command line task which we have used. It is printing I'm in job 1, step 1, and that is the value 1, which is the value of the variable 1. Similarly, if I expand the job 2, I'm into job 2, step 1, and it is returning the value of the parameters which we have used. Second job, if I open, it will show the same. I'm into job 1, step 1, and the value 1. This is how you can use the variables and define the multi-stage pipeline with the YAML, and you can investigate. Now if you look at here about the individual jobs, you can see that the jobs are running on the agent pool. You'll find the information about the agent pool and the machine number on which this particular job is running. So it's running as the VSTS user, and then it's next thing it is doing by default is checking out the source code repository, the repository which on which this particular pipeline is being defined. So that's what it's trying to grab all the source code, and then it's running the job or the task which we have defined. Once it runs all the tasks in the job which we have defined, it runs the cleanup activity. For example, it does the cleaning any kind of a caching or credentials from the repository, from the hosted agent, and then later on it runs the finish job activity. And these 4 common activities you will find across all the jobs, all the steps. So that is common, given by default by Azure DevOps. So nothing to worry about it if you find it strange here on the pipeline. Now, a couple of other things to look at here on the pipeline. If I edit here, you can anytime go ahead and enable or disable the pipeline by clicking here on the pipeline settings. So if you want to enable, disable, or pause the pipeline, you can do that. If you want to change the path of the YAML file, or if you want to use any other YAML file to replace this particular pipeline definition, you can change it right here from this particular section. Next, you can go to the triggers option and you can define the different parameters of the configuration of the YAML pipeline right here from this particular option. For example, you can enable the continuous integration right here with the continuous integration trigger option. You can define the schedule build option. So it's the same window what we have seen with the classical pipeline, but it's just more of managing your pipeline through YAML with this configuration option basically. Now, if you would like to change the repository branch or repository name, you can change it right here from this particular section. Later on, if you want to modify these settings to the existing pipeline, again, you can change the YAML pipeline path. You can anytime modify it here. If I click here on this 3 dot, it will navigate to the repository which I am into, and then from this repository location I can change the path of the pipeline anytime. I can modify the name of the pipeline right here from either this option or this option, whichever is fine, and then simply I can either save and queue, save, or save as a draft if I want to. This was just to give you an idea how do you use the Azure DevOps YAML based pipeline. But if you would like to follow a specific video on how to configure a complex YAML based pipeline, I do have certain number of videos available in Azure to configure the pipeline. Let's say configure a pipeline, deployment pipeline with Terraform, that's also there. We also have a video on configuring the CI/CD pipeline, which is a YAML based pipeline with Azure Data Factory. If you would like to use that, this is also an option available. I hope you have found this useful. If it is, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks for watching it. See you in the next video.